host KPACT for us. We have been hosting KPACT since 2014 as a way for building community amongst therapists who work in the kink and polyamory communities. We also host an online home for folks to get involved through being part of our Google group or connecting with other professionals for referrals. I'm going to be honest, I don't have my notes now because my computer just died. So I'm going off the top of my head, but I think so if I forget something and one of the LifeWorks folks here wants to chime in, please let me know. So we are going to go over some Zoom logistics before our presenters get started. Actually, Essie, do me a favor. Would you mind going onto the KPACT website and pulling up the bios for our presenters? Then you can offer those once I do the Zoom logistics. How does that sound?
For sure.
Great. We're figuring this out. Okay, so Zoom logistics, please stay muted for most of the event, unless you are speaking or asking a question. You can feel free to be on or off your video, but please stay muted and we will mute you if there's like sort of extra sound. So don't be offended, we're just trying to help folks here. If you would like to see the speaker more clearly, you could try using the speaker view, which is in the upper right-hand corner of your little box, and you can see the speaker speaking. Please change your name, if possible, to your name and your pronouns, which would be in the little 3 dots in the right corner of your video so people can see how to refer to you. And if you'd like to talk and ask questions, please use the chat function, which is in the right side of your screen. And you can go ahead and put questions in there. We'll be monitoring the chat and let the presenters know if they have something that we would like to ask for them in the moment. Otherwise, we can do questions and answers at the end as well. You can also use the hand raise function if that would be more useful to be able to ask your question in real time. Any questions anyone has about Zoom logistics or how this is going to run? Okay, great. So we're here for a presentation, A Rainbow is Not Enough. And Essie, if you could please give intros for our wonderful presenters.
Absolutely. We're really excited to welcome Kez Mayers and Richard Sprott. Kez specializes in sex therapy and sex education. Kez has extensive experience in treating sexual dysfunctions, addressing problematic sexual behaviors, sex-related issues, infidelity, kink-related issues, and navigating polyamorous and kink relationships. Kez is a kink knowledgeable professional through the National Coalition of Sexual Freedom. She is also a researcher and member of the social media outreach team on the International Kink Health Study. Additionally, Kez does contract work as a FetLife liaison for Tashra. Richard Sprott received his PhD in developmental psychology from UC Berkeley in 1994. As a researcher, he has examined in detail the relationship between professional identity development and the development of professional ethics in medical doctors, ministers, and teachers, and professional identity development in emerging fields of work. He is currently directing research projects focused on identity development and health well-being in people who express alternative sexualities and non-traditional relationships, with a special emphasis on kink, BDSM sexuality, and polyamory or consensual non-monogamy. He is also co-chair of the Children, Youth, and Families Committees of the Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. Richard currently teaches courses in the Department of Human Development and Women's Studies at California State University, East Bay, and graduate level courses at various universities in the Bay Area, including UC Berkeley and the Holy Names University. So welcome, Kez and Richard. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to basically do the first half and then turn things over to our clinician, Kez, to talk about clinical issues and to help us think about and discuss a particular case. So again, please ask questions either in the chat or you can raise your hand at any time. But we will have time for questions and answers at the end as well. Let me share my screen. All right. So a rainbow is not enough, intersectionality of race and kink. The title actually comes from a quote from a African-American kinkster who was talking a lot about some of the issues that come up when it comes to race and kink, especially experiences in the community. And it just, it has stuck with me for a long time. We don't have any conflicts of interest or any kind of commercial support for this CE presentation. And I do want to say, I'm going to go over the first part is like what's happening in the literature, what's happening in the scholarship and the research when it comes to, in particular, racial ethnic diversity and leather kink BDSM fetish. And a lot of that work, if you go into this area, a lot of it has been done really in the past 15 years or so. Probably especially, there's been quite a lot done, a lot written in the last, I would say, probably 6 or 7 years in particular. However, if you go in and you look for the empirical research, you find that most research and most research has really been focused on sort of like, internet samples and, snowball sampling where you're trying to reach, in essence, a sort of a sometimes hidden community. And when doing that, there tends to be an overwhelmingly white representation in those kind of samples. So much so that roughly it's about 85% in a lot of studies. So keeping that in mind when we talk about what do we know about kink, kink sexuality, kink things. So that's sort of like part of the backdrop, and we'll discuss that. And so generalizability for a lot of what we do know about kink is still very limited in who it applies to and who we can talk about with a little bit of confidence. When we created this presentation, we had this intended audience in mind, sort of intermediate level, meaning that some basic familiarity with leather kink, etc., polyamory, all of that stuff would be assumed. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail trying to explain all of that. And so I don't know that any of those kinds of questions will come up, but maybe. So like I said, during this time, we're going to review the research and the scholarly work that's done on the intersections of kink and race, do an overview of some clinical issues that come up in particular at this intersection, and then do a case presentation and discussion. So the research and the scholarship, there's a few, like I said, it's really been in probably the past 7, 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years that a lot has actually been written. So it's very kind of new and fresh. If you go into it, undoubtedly you will come across Ariane Cruz, who has done a number of studies. A lot of it is captured in the 2016 book, The Color of Kink, Black Women, BDSM, and Pornography. But there have been a couple of other things surrounding that particular work, and the latest that I've read is the Not a Moment Too Soon, a juncture of BDSM and race, where she reflects that there is this like interest in the literature that has increased really in the past 6 or 7 or 8 years. And so I want to capture some of the ideas that in Dr. Cruz's work. So some key ideas. Dr. Cruz talks about the racial caveat, noticing this pattern in the research and the scholarship on race and kink. So it's this acknowledgement. You often see it as, again, especially in the past 10 years or so, you see an acknowledgement of the absence of sort of like racial information or enough racial and ethnic diversity to make any kind of conclusions, looking at particular possible differences or dynamics within racial ethnic minorities who are involved in kink. So a lot of articles will sort of say, oh, we acknowledge that there's this problem, and then they just kind of move on with their, reporting their work and with the analysis. And there is this then this pattern that shows up, which is essentially, well, race is sort of acknowledged, but then it disappears, right? As a particular lens to really look at what's going on. So it's a way of like sort of acknowledging it, but then going on to talk and to, in essence, ignore it. A kind of marginalization that happens in the literature. So that's that's definitely a pattern that we see when it comes to kink studies or BDSM studies. Some key ideas in terms of Dr. Cruz's own analysis is that, in particular, she proposes that BDSM is, because of its inclusion and in focus on pleasure and pain, the sort of the complementary, the simultaneity of pleasure and pain, that this actually creates a useful and important way to think about the link between violence and Black female sexuality. So a lot of her work is focused just on that. I'm going to illustrate that in a couple of minutes. The other thing that pops out from really looking closely at BDSM and Black female sexuality is that so much it's very clear that things like consent and pleasure are key elements that really distinguish the reasons why Black female kinksters are what they're experiencing when they're involved in kink or BDSM, and how important consent and pleasure are. So there is a big focus in her work on consent and pleasure. Here's a bit of it. Here's a little bit more detail in what she's noticed in some of her work. So there are strong voices for BDSM in Black women's experience, and there's also strong voices against Black women's BDSM involvement. So she's noted, other people have noted that writers and philosophers like Audre Lorde and Alice Walker has spoken very powerfully about how dangerous and damaging BDSM is, especially for Black women. We'll have a quote in a second. But there, of course, are other Black writers and professionals who are involved in BDSM who are speaking and writing about how empowering BDSM is, especially for Black women. So there's a lot of tension around this in particular. So this was from an interview with Audre Lorde. Sadomasochism is an institutionalized celebration of dominant subordinate relationships, and it prepares us to either accept subordination or dominance, even in play, to affirm that the exertion of power over powerlessness is erotic, is empowering, is to set the emotional and social stage for the continuation of that relationship politically, socially, and economically. Let that sink in for a minute. Tina Portillo is a member of the BDSM community, a professional, and a social influencer. If someone desires a scenario such as a plantation slave and master, or cowboy and Indian, as long as it is mutual and done in a loving spirit, that's all that matters and all I care about. Cruz captures this, recasts this in the following way: mutually consensual pleasure in the moment, regardless of whether such rapture is linked to the internalization or the perpetuation, conscious, unconscious, or subconscious, of oppressive white heteropatriarchal supremacist structures and values, past, present, and future, is what matters, right? Mutually consensual pleasure is what matters. So that's the sort of like take that a number of people have proposed when it comes to involvement in BDSM. This is still Dr. Cruz. Lord and Walker question whether Black women can indeed consent to racialized sexual play. Black women BDSMers, however, suggest that it is precisely this consent that is not only possible, but is also pleasurable. And then in her work, she goes on to show that, and to really examine that there's things that complicate this discussion, right? This disagreement. The one is often the line between fantasy and reality. For example, people arguing against say that line between fantasy and reality is a little fuzzy, a little permeable, or there's a spillover or something like that. But there's something about that line that is problematic. Whereas those people who are promoting BDSM involvement, these Black women in particular, are very clear that, okay, there's fantasy and then there's reality, and that actually is an important distinction and part of the reason why consent and pleasure can happen. The line between the past and the present also often shows up in a lot of these arguments, and how can we, which part do we focus on? Can we put a line in between the past and present? Isn't that kind of fuzzy? The line between Black and white races, right? Again, the racial categories themselves are not, not binary, and they're not necessarily, they're fuzzy, right? So the line between them can also be very problematic. And the line between the body and the mind. And in her analysis, she really notes that a lot of BDSM involved people, when thinking about race and kink, will often make this a strong distinction again, that in essence, it's sort of like, yes, I know in my mind there are these, heteropatriarchal, systems, and they influence, people's experiences outside the dungeon, outside BDSM, and they are to be taken serious. But the body wants sort of pleasure, and the body has its own kind of logic. So they make a strong, again, distinction between body and mind here. Whereas again, those people who are arguing against that or arguing that BDSM is harmful, especially for Black women, all of these lines are just a little fuzzy. And so because of that, there's a heightened danger, right? So that's that whole part of the scholarship that's really, and it's very, it's very dynamic and active and present. If we look at some other areas of kink studies, this year, Erickson and others out of the Northern Illinois University lab, the Science of BDSM lab, did do this study and published these results this year, where they recruited 398 adults, both online and in person, at regional events, regional kink and leather and fetish events. And in particular, they were making sure to reach out to people of color. And so they have a sample of about almost 31% of their participants were people of color. And they look specifically a lot at questions about race and kink. The first thing they noticed was that statistically, people of color were less likely to identify as submissive when asked about their kink identities. Almost 46%, 45.8% of people of color felt discriminated against at BDSM events, right? But people who did not identify as a person of color, only 4.9% of them felt discriminated against at a BDSM event. So really big difference. 63% of those who identified as a person of color felt fetishized, right? Fetishized due to their race and ethnicity at a BDSM event, while only 9% of people who did not identify as a person of color had felt that at a BDSM event. And 11.3% of the people of color felt fetishized specifically for race play, right? Responses include things like white submissive males wanting to serve me just because I'm Black. Right? So we have some hard numbers to really look at and to sort of take a different viewpoint of what's happening here. There's been a couple of other things published in the past couple of years. A critical microethnographic examination of power exchange, role identity, and agency with Black BDSM practitioners from the University of Central Florida, and Catherine Martinez's Overwhelming Whiteness of BDSM, which was a critical discourse analysis of both interviews and certain online conversations when asking people about race and kink. From Amber Norman's work, there were several themes that showed up. That study is a very in-depth qualitative study of Black BDSM practitioners. One that showed up in that was the difficulty with submissive roles. I pulled this to illustrate that. When interview participants were asked about the roles they enacted during BDSM play, some shared how race and gendered expectations can negatively impact one's ability to access submission. Norman's work also looked at and noted that issues around hypermasculinity and gender role expectations also showed up as people were talking about their experiences at this intersection of race and kink. So standards of hypermasculinity in the Black community. Again, it's sort of related to the submission stuff. But also, I pulled this because it shows that standards of hypermasculinity in the Black community may also apply to masculine presenting women, consequently denying them an opportunity to embody a submissive stance in BDSM play. So that came up in the analysis. Amber Norman also really noted the clashing experiences of power. I found this to be a good quote to capture this. Racial and gender-based violence means that Black women have long been initiated into a top-down understanding of power, an approach that BDSM culture actively challenges, right? So there's a lot of the dissertation really looked at this. So there's this history of socialization about power. And then in the BDSM community, there's a very different view of power and how that becomes kind of a point of, perhaps a point of some difficulty that's especially relevant to, in particular, Black women, but I think racial, ethnic, diverse people. The current trend not to play in public spaces is also something that popped up in that work. Jet Setting Jasmine and Miss Marla do not host BDSM events in public dungeon spaces. And again, a number of her participants really said very clearly that they don't feel comfortable in those public dungeon spaces, they don't go to them, and that they prefer to play more in private spaces, even private parties, if not just, in their own homes. So, so noting that particular trend, which I think has some implications for how people experience the BDSM community. Catherine Martinez's work and looking at the discourses around race and kink noted that basically all the white people in her study really discussed, the reason why there aren't that many people of color in the BDSM community, or at least in the public BDSM community, is because there are these economic and educational sort of barriers. So it's really expensive to buy all this gear and these outfits, and a lot of them said, well, I got exposed to BDSM in college, so maybe there are some like educational things here that are the reason why that people of color don't show up. So the discourse definitely focuses on that, and that becomes then the explanation for why aren't there any people of color here. But it's interesting when you talk to people of color, they discuss the racial bias and stigma that is experienced in these, BDSM events, in these particular spaces, is the reason why they don't go, right? So again, this kind of very clearly racialized experience is really affecting how people even try to make sense of why are there so few, So Catherine Martinez's work, I think, does a good job of documenting this particular problem. A couple of other things. Dimage, touching race through play, sadomasochism phenomenology and intertwine of race and sexuality. And Liang, playing with power, kink, race and desires, which basically just came out a few weeks ago. Ada Dimage writes, in particular, that that in fact, even in the real world, power, unequal power relationships, dominance and submission, things that get acted out, consensually, non-consensually, But if you look at the structures, that there's already a kind of erotic aspect to them. And so what she basically argues here is that, you know, it's not that perverts are running around and suddenly eroticizing power differences and these unequal power relationships. It's much more that's already there. And these perverts are essentially just acknowledging something which is already true. So that's an interesting analysis and take. Dimage also notes and kind of incorporates McClintock's historical analysis of SM, which shows that, again, the connection to capitalism here, that capitalism is based and is built on racial differences, and that in particular, collars and chains to denote submission was basically incorporated. It starts to show up in SM history, and it starts to become part of the sort of aesthetics right at that time when the economy is shifting from slave labor to wage labor. And so there are these roots that in fact kind of connect to and go back to issues of class and race and economics. So Dimage's particular point is, in looking at all of this, is that patriarchal and racist ideologies and practices create harm in society because they're often invisible and very stealthy, right? Behind the scenes or not spoken about, even if they are apparent. And that race play in particular kind of dramatizes, it emphasizes, it brings up very clearly patriarchal and racist ideologies and practices. And so in that sense, there's some possible good work that can come out of race play because it dramatizes something which is already, again, working and functioning and affecting our experiences. Liang talks about, in particular, and we said before that the line between things like fantasy and reality and the line between past and present and everything like that has already been like that's part of the issue, right? About is BDSM harmful or not? The blurring of boundaries between fantasy and reality, between play and the rest of life, is a concern for people of color particularly. And she calls that blurring of boundaries in her work, she calls it slippage. Several of my interlocutors' reasons for preferring queer and people of color play partners, moreover, suggest that safety and equality of other queer people of color provide a more equal power vacuum in which to negotiate the construction of artificial, right, power dynamics that in fact, it's maybe not so clear in this quote, but the idea that it's easier to negotiate around power exchange when you feel more equal, and that often sort of racial ethnic differences and marginalizations of people of color, which is happening in the real world, can sort of affect how negotiation of power exchange can actually happen. And so, again, that safety and equality becomes pretty critical. And the reason why that slippage then between those lines, between fantasy and between play and the rest of life, between fantasy and reality, has particularly important and powerful repercussions for people of color as opposed to white people. My interviews demonstrated that the privilege of slippage, right? This is an interesting idea. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And that is, okay, so you have this fuzzy boundary between play and the rest of life, between fantasy and reality, between the past and the present. And if you cross that, right, if it gets too fuzzy and it becomes confusing and you cross that sort of boundary, who pays the price, right? Or who gets away with it? And so the privilege of slippage is a privilege that is not available to all, at least because marginalized communities encounter aggression and trauma on a daily basis, thus demanding clear structures to explore desires that play with this aggression or play with this trauma. So again, the negotiation part, the working out the scene, the consent from this position is complicated by this stuff, and the privilege of slippage of basically, who can do that, who can, encounter this or even cause this blurring of boundaries, and then who has to pay the price for it. Certainly trust is a central part of kink, right? And Liang notes that trust is a central part of kink for white cisgender men as well, but the trust they describe is different from the trust that a participant, Melanie, demands and fosters, right, in her BDSM play. So this idea that what trust means, I think, is an important area to really reflect on and to really analyze, and to analyze critically. So that's sort of like the literature. There's a lot of really interesting ideas out there, some important facts really starting to come out about race and kink. So it feels like right now there's a lot more information that we have from a lot of this scholarship, from a lot of these empirical studies that I think will really help to inform our clinical work, I think. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Kez to talk about the clinical issues. Just briefly, though, were there any particular questions about the scholarship or the literature? That very quick overview I did. Okay. I see a comment that things already fell apart, so I would love to hear more about that in our discussion, if it's okay. Kez, would you talk about the clinical issues?
Yes. Thank you, Richard, for really highlighting some of the findings from the research. And I love how the research really gives some language to describe what kinds of things happen on the individual level. And leading into this next discussion about clinical issues, I want to speak a little bit about my background and experiences, because that gives a little bit more context here. So I've been a member of the kink community for almost 10 years now. Wow, I'm getting really old. Almost 10 years now. I identify as kinky, and I engage in a lot of different power exchange relationships. I also identify as queer, that has had cis female relationships, cis male relationships. I've been in relationships with a bunch of people on the spectrum of the LGBTQ+ community. And I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, so I'm a Caribbean girl. Can I make my mic louder? I can speak a little bit louder. There's a lot of volume issues that go on with Zoom. So is this a little bit better? Okay, awesome. I was born in the Caribbean, so I have a particular culture that's really, there's a lot of shame and guilt around sex. And so as I was exploring my own personal kink interests, there was a lot of shame and guilt that I held on to. And when I participated in the kink community, there were a lot of things that I experienced that I didn't necessarily know how to describe. And having this unique perspective and this experience of mine going into a graduate program and being a counselor and further being a sex therapist and sex educator, I was able to see these things that these findings from the research a little bit more clearly, especially with my clients of color. And so based on my particular client and counselor relationships, as well as speaking to a lot of different practitioners in the field who work with kinky clients, there's a lot of clinical issues that present to themselves. So first of all, being the fetishization of skin color and race. There's such a big issue that a lot of people of color report in their participation in kink spaces of people wanting to connect with them and play with them based on skin color, race, and ethnicity rather than their character. And this makes them feel a little bit more isolated from the community at large. Another clinical issue is that assumption of being involved in hardcore forms of play, including edge play and the big kahuna race play. And with this assumption, it's really leaning on that lack of consent of I'm just assuming that you're into these types of play, so I'm going to engage you in that way, rather than asking you, you know, what are your interests? What do you like doing? What do you want to do? What are your limits? And there's a lack of that. I'm not seeing representation in the community. This is the most important issue that comes up in the clinical practice of when people of color enter into a public play space, a dungeon, a party, a private party, that they don't see enough people that look like them or would be considered a person of color. And this also leads to a feeling of isolation and loneliness. And so through that, as mentioned before in the research, there is a tendency for people of color to play in more private spaces because they're able to be around their people more frequently than in a public space. And one of the negative consequences of that is the more people of color play in private spaces, the less that they appear in public spaces, which also make new people coming into the community less able to connect with it because they don't see enough of each other. And playing on this idea of not having any representation, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing. Let me see if it's also a Zoom issue. My volume wasn't up all the way. Is this a little bit better? Awesome. Sweet. There's always going to be some technical difficulties in a Zoom chat. All right. Leaning on the issue of not seeing representation in the community is not having mentors in the community to lean into. And if you participate in the community a lot, you know that there's a lot of mentors who provide guidance and education, also almost like in the role of a counselor, just guiding their way through the community and their experiences without judgment. But for people of color, because there's not a lot of people who play in public spaces, let alone people in high degrees of consideration and power in the community, there's a lack of that guidance of I'm telling you how things are. If you have any issues, come to me, that protection, that communion. Ooh, yeah, there we go. Other common clinical issues. And so I would consider that there's two primary areas of clinical issues, one being on the individual level, and the other being the counseling microcosm. And so we all know, like, the counseling microcosm is that little representation of what goes on in the world that kind of makes itself known in the counseling relationship. And so there are several variables that affect the client and counselor relationship and influence client outcomes. And these are just a few of many. So definitely that medical distrust in communities of color, given historical studies and experiments against people of color, that there is that natural and generational distrust. Cultural differences, value differences, that when faced with, if you are a white counselor with a person of color, there's a lack of understanding of the cultural nuances of being a person of color that does influence the client and counselor relationship. And most importantly, the systemic differences of power through race and class. And so even as a woman of color counselor with white clients, this is something that I continuously have to address. Hey, what is it like for you to have a woman of color as your therapist? What do you think this will impact your relationship with me? And we call that broaching. And it also has to happen in reverse. We have to directly confront those systemic differences of power because it does impact the client and counselor relationship. And this is just a big layer, not even considering kink and BDSM. And so this also leads to what was also apparent in the research findings. So people of color struggle with embracing submissive roles. So bottoms, being a bottom, being a stud, being a slave, especially being a slave and having that title. Because we've been historically marginalized and subjugated, that embracing and eroticizing this role, there's a feeling of guilt and a feeling of shame that goes with, like, this is pleasurable to me, but I don't want to admit that it's pleasurable to me, because in all areas of my life, that doesn't feel good. And due to stereotypes of deviancy, violence, and criminality, a lot of my clients are less inclined to be open to family, to friends, even to themselves about BDSM and kink interest, or let alone participating in the community. Familial, cultural, religious beliefs and values, all of the things associated with being in a collectivist culture. There is a lot of stigma against sex and talking about sex and loving sex, and even further, being interested in certain forms of play. And so this inhibits some people's willingness to engage or be open about their kink interests or participate in the community. And so these are some common clinical issues. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are the most common that I see quite a bit. And so we will be moving into a case presentation of Kaya. I'll ask you all a couple of questions within the big group, and then we will move into breakout rooms for more in-depth questions and conversation. So we have the case of Kaya. And so as a counselor, you have been working with Kaya for a few weeks. So Kaya is 32 years old, cis female, bisexual, Black, born and raised in Jamaica, single, and has no children. You have been working with her on acceptance, normalization, and exploration of her kink interest in submission, bondage, and sensation play. Due to the stigmatizing cultural beliefs she was raised with, she finds it difficult to reach out to others in the kink community. Upon discussion, she decides to sign up for a few kink-focused community sites and registers for a few munches and events. After 2 munches and 1 bondage event, Kaya reports that she's unsure about future participation in the kink community. When probed, Kaya recounts her experiences. So Kaya explained that after signing up for the sites, she received several messages from men that made her uneasy, such as, "You're gonna suck my white cock. I want to worship an ebony goddess. Oh, your skin is so beautiful. I've never been with a black goddess before." And invitations to engage in race play. She reported that they weren't a big deal and shouldn't bother her, but they did. She barely received messages or replies from other women. She further explained that when going to the munches, she felt strangely out of place and did not relate to most of the people there. She did make one friend that she would keep in contact with and attend the bondage event with. She described the bondage event as thrilling and exciting to see others enjoy what she enjoys. Despite attending with someone else, she recalled feeling alone and out of place. She reported that she was uninterested in taking on a mentor when her friend suggested it, but couldn't verbalize why. And so for our big group discussion, there are two questions that I have for you. One being, what are some reasons that Kaya may be unable to engage with the kink community? And why could Kaya be uninterested in having a mentor? And whoever wants to go first, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if someone else is speaking.
I think the concept of a mentor might scare some people off, especially if you're just like dabbling.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Like if I'm just like trying to get a feel for the space, right? A mentor seems like commitment to doing something that I'm not even sure I even really liked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if there's not representation of people who have her lived experience as a Black woman, particularly from Jamaica, bisexual, all of her intersecting identities, that would be really difficult if you're having trouble finding a spot in the community, but you'd want a mentor who really you feel you can connect with, be vulnerable with, and see yourself represented. And if they're, the statistics you presented earlier, I'm going to guess if we apply it to this case study, there wasn't anyone in that room that would have been someone she could connect with in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess to add to that, if she did not feel connected to the community, then why would she want a mentor from within that community?
Absolutely. Not feeling that belongingness and not seeing anyone that had her lived experience. It's unlikely if she already didn't have interest in further exploring the community, why would she have a mentor? Yeah. Anyone else? Let me take a couple more before we move into the breakout rooms. All right, so great time to move in to the other discussion questions in breakout rooms. And so there are three main questions. So if Kaya was your client, what interventions or approaches would you apply? And if Kaya was your own client, how would your own sexual beliefs impact the therapeutic relationship and choice of interventions and approaches? And how would your own race and culture impact the therapeutic relationship and choice of interventions and approaches? And these questions are all in the document that was shared. So download that so you'll have it when you move into the breakout groups. See you all soon.
Kez, how long do you want to give folks in breakout rooms? Oh, she's gone. Okay.
Richard, you're muted.
They're groups of roughly 4 or 5, or is
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
I would say giving people maybe 15 to 20 minutes to really discuss these 3 questions would be appropriate.
Okay.
Do that.
I'll just send a message to folks so they know how much
Okay.
time they'll have.
That's a good idea.
I think maybe some people didn't know they had to download it before they left.
Uh-oh.
So if Essie, if people come back, it might be because they need to get the document.
Okay.
Essie, why don't you send a message?
The chat should be available to them in the breakout rooms.
Really?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
Are you getting messages that people are having trouble?
Just Cindy.
Oh.
She said the others don't see it in her group either, so I don't know.
Oh. I can pop into a breakout room and see if I still have access to the chat and then come back.
Yeah, you could try that. You could pop into Cindy's and see what's up.
Okay, I will do that. I'm just gonna make my rounds to the rooms and reshare.
Did they not have it?
Cindy didn't. Yeah, I don't know.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it all okay, Essie? Essie, they're all right, everyone?
all. We're all coming back. I think everyone is here. I don't know about you, but I had a great conversation in my group. And if anyone wants to share some big takeaways or points of discussion that came up in your breakout room.
I wonder if it was a difficult for people to talk about. I mean, one of the things that came up for me with the questions right away was, like, it is really hard to, it's easy to say, all right, I understand these things about how my sexuality or my race may be a part of what's going on. But what's hard is to understand the things that we don't know, the parts that we can't see, right? Which is really oftentimes where we step into things unknowingly with people and don't even know, until after the fact, right? So I wonder if that was difficult for other people.
It's a really good point. Yeah.
One thing that came up for us is to always be aware and not make any assumptions. An example that came up for us is stigmatizing cultural beliefs. For some reason, all three of us in our group thought religious, spiritual with that. And we say, oh, it doesn't say about church or religion or anything like that. So just being aware of our own biases and not making assumptions around. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Religion is a big one. Usually that's cultural for a lot of people. These are our cultural beliefs, our cultural practices, or cultural values that take form in our religious practices. And that is a really big discussion, a really big impact.
Yeah, and that lives on even if consciously there's a sense I don't agree with those things, or I've chosen or found a different cultural context or family of choice. The religious and cultural grooves run deep. And the study mentioned that shame for her. And so I think one of the things we talked about is early on as she's kind of clearing and expressing this process, real positive regard and affirming and accepting. And I think the other piece one of my group mates said was, when the time is right, highlighting and coming back to what was really positive in that experience, that she found being in a space where other people shared similar interests and joys that she did was one really great gem of an otherwise real challenging situation. So I almost lost that piece given all the other complexities we were talking about, but that was a real special piece. And maybe how do you find that in a place where you can get your other needs met?
Following that thread, right? Like you said, it's really easy to miss that really positive aspect because there were so many other things that for her she didn't consider to be negative, but really did cloud her willingness to engage into the community. But there's that little piece of, I feel accepted in this way of, here are other people who are doing the things that I enjoy doing. And that felt really thrilling and exciting. Yeah. It's good to lean into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder, Kaz, if you or Richard, if you could say something about this idea of slippage and how it might show up in the therapy relationship, and how, I don't know what I remember when you were talking about it, Richard, you said something about that the negotiation then in the kink space has to be very like, I don't know how you said it, but like took away very clear, very explicit. And I'm wondering how all that translates over into a clinical space where I imagine there is a certain kind of negotiation that's happening, and how can we, me as a white therapist working with people of color, how can I be more crisp in my own, presentation, discussion, sharing, so that that slippage, if it can be mitigated, can be mitigated.
Well, I think it is that fuzzy line, right? I think in some ways there is like, for a lot of us, the having a clear line, right? A clear category, a clear, boundary makes us feel safer and less anxious. And yet at the same time, it's like that whole, like, I guess what I want to say is listening for that kind of like ambivalence, listening for that, that it is it's not a clear line, right? And so how does this particular client handle that? And again, it seemed to be very that a lot of people sort of insist on that line being absolutely clear. I mean, we do the same thing with consent, right? The consent thing has to be really, really clear, as if there was like this really clear line. And the fact of the matter is that life is messy, and that our experiences are messy, and so there is going to be like this slippage. But it's interesting. I always like, I'm always listening for, okay, so if by its very nature it's fuzzy, this is me putting on my queer theory, right? Hat, right? Queer theory says, that line, right? That category, that thing that we want, right, to be really, really clear, and you're either, on one side or the other. Queer theory basically really interrogates and questions, right? Is there even a line there? And how do people, right, really react to that? So in some ways, I think listening, it's almost motivational interviewing for me, in the sense of I'm listening for the ambivalence. I'm listening for the complexity, really, of the person and how they're kind of reacting, and then not taking the focus off that. A couple months ago, I think, or something like that, we had Avgi Sakatopoulou, who's a psychoanalyst in New York, do a presentation for Tashra. And a lot of it was really focused on, consent is really, really messy. And we would like it to be clean. And I've seen a number of other analyses where, wanting that category and that line and that binary to be absolutely clear is kind of a white supremacist thing, right? It's that thinking that then, gets built on, okay, so who's in this category, who's not, who gets, treated better and who doesn't. So whenever I'm thinking about that slippage, or I'm thinking about that fuzziness, To me, that's like, no, that's actual the real experience. And listening for that and trying to make space for it so that it doesn't get shunted away or either by the client or the therapist, right? I guess that's my sort of like thoughts about slippage. And then the analysis of like, okay, and so when things are messy, somebody might get hurt, right? There might be consent mistakes. There might be really difficult negotiations that don't actually work out very well. There might be a whole host of things that kind of go wrong where somebody gets hurt and or harmed. And it's sort of a trying to make space so that that gets to come out, even if the first initial reaction is there's no problem here, or it was very clear. And I thought Avgi in her presentation, which really focused a lot on how slippery consent is, and and there are lots of like, you know, she's a psychoanalyst, so of course there's a deep subconscious, you know, sort of like multiple motivations all going on all at the same time, and they all need to be, you know, honored, not just the stuff that looks neat and shiny and in some ways sort of abstracted from the messiness of actual experience. So I'll stop, but those are some of my thoughts about it and about how it might show up.
I thought of all of those things that you just said, Richard, as well as I think because I also see a lot of clients with trauma, and racialized trauma is a big thing, generational racial trauma, and being in kink scenes that when that slippage happens results in some trauma. Through your question, Cindy, I thought of this podcast that was presented by Marla Renee Stewart. I don't remember the podcaster's name at the time, but she was talking about a race play scene in which there was so much slippage, particularly between past and present, that the past became the present, and what they were reenacting was an actual race power exchange, and she could not verbalize her safe words, and the scene was going past what was negotiated, and there was such a feeling of helplessness and isolation even when other people were present that she could not speak. She could only express that generational experience in that moment. And so it becomes really easy, especially when engaging in race play, to have slippage where there is an experience of trauma, either activated or created in that moment.
Thank you both for your thoughts on that. I appreciate it.
Any other highlights from your discussions? And then we can move into more of a question and answer. All right. And so does anyone have any questions about the research findings, about clinical issues, anything that we've mentioned today?
I'm wondering, Kez, is there anything in particular you think about when working with someone who's like considering doing more race-based play? Obviously, like your relationship with them would be different than mine as a therapist, but I'm just curious if generally you have thoughts on like, if someone's like, I think I want to try this, but I don't know how I'm going to be about it, you know?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to like face my own particular beliefs and dilemma around race play and what that represents for me and what comes up when that question comes up from a client, that I kind of have to do my own mini processing. But for clients, and I haven't actually had a client that expressed a desire to engage in race play, but if I were to have a client who would do that, my first and foremost thing is to like, awesome, like this is a new world to discover. There's so many things and so many positives in engaging with race play, and really assessing for what they will get out of it in terms of positives, and then really talk through their concerns, because clients also have their concerns about particular forms of play. And then we talk about boundaries and limits, right? What are your boundaries? What are your limits? Do they have the capacity to set boundaries for themselves and to engage in using their safe words if things do get out of hand? Because there is that increased capacity for slippage, and therefore some trauma if that were to happen. And so boundaries and assessing limits are one of the most important things that I would work on. And just being able to discuss what happened, what was great about the experience, what was not so great, and what can we do to plan ahead for a better experience next time.
I think for me, a big part of that conversation is, so what does aftercare look like for you? All right, who are you going to get it from? It may not be, you know, if you're doing race play, it may not be the person who was just in that, you know, very violent, aggressive role. So you may need it from other people. So have you thought about that? And so that's definitely something that I think would be a big thing to ask about when you're, you know, talking through all of that, like boundaries and things like that too. It's you know, I'm still trying to make sense of it, but your question prompted this memory for me of a conversation. So I'm part of the 15 Association in San Francisco, which is a gay, bisexual men's, you know, BDSM social gathering group. We get together and play, and it was interesting. One of the rules they have for their play parties is some things about sound and how loud you can be. And it wasn't necessarily about, you know, people yelling or screaming too much. They actually created a rule about how loud you could be because of race play. Because they did not want, they were worried about, and some people who were members were worried about, well, here I am over here in this, corner, and all of a sudden that scene that's happening over there is like, I can't help but overhear, right? I can't help but hear that. And if it involves, and it usually does, a lot of very verbal humiliation, a lot of racist language, that would be way more disturbing than somebody screaming their head off. Of course, it came back up because now we've got a couple people who really scream their head off, and it is a little distracting. And all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm sorry, but that rule is not about screaming, it's about race play. And it's like, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know how I feel about that.
Absolutely. Oh, yes. And to your point of aftercare, Richard, within that, also a repair process. What does repair look like?
Really good point.
And a check-in. Probably a little bit more often than a regular placing. Got another question. What are some of the positives of race play? And this looks different across the board. A lot of people report different things. I think the most reported one is absolutely the consent part of I am consensually engaging in this dynamic rather than an environment where I'm not consenting to this. And so it's kind of a little bit of a reclamation of power that I'm choosing to do this. Other positives, because race play can take on different forms, so white dominant, black submissive, or black dominant, white submissive, there is that positive of role reversal of now I'm in a position of power, being more powerful than the person who is in power in our regular lives. And so that's empowering for a lot of people to be given power and to take it. For that question. Those are some of the most reported that I've seen. What about you, Richard?
What I've heard is basically somewhat similar to why would anybody do trauma play, right? Or anything like that. It's about kind of reclaiming, one's experience and one's power, and that, again, people have had by being able to do it within this container of, well, we've consented and we're doing things, I kind of go back to consent and pleasure, it's sort of those reasons, and having that as the container tends to be an important element. And I think in how people, it's not just stress relief. It is kind of like going back and healing from trauma in some ways. So I tend to hear when people talk about it, it tends to sound like that to me. I think there might be an element of the edge play and taboo thing kind of going on too, that it's exciting to approach those things. It intensifies the erotic charge because we're breaking a taboo. So that might be part of it as well. So what would be the positive of race play in that? I guess, well, it at least for those people who, wherever their headset, headspace, mindset is, it can really intensify things in a way that I don't know that other things could in the same way, right? When you're playing specifically on that particular expression of a power difference.
A question.
Yes, Rami.
Hi. So I've been sitting here kind of reflecting on what Danielle's question was, and I had something somewhat similar, maybe a little different. So I've been a clinician for several decades, and in the last one, a lot more folks have come out as kinky and polyamorous and so forth, in part because of the practice that we have. But I've only had a handful of Black folks who have come and spoken about this with me. And I did have one woman who wanted to engage in race play. And I felt very strongly that it would be clinically not a good idea. But because of my whiteness, I backed away from saying something about it because I was aware of perhaps it was my bias as opposed to what might be right for this person, for this woman. Unfortunately, even with all of the things that we've talked about, consent and aftercare and boundaries and safe words and all the things that we went through, it was a very, very re-traumatizing experience. And I kind of kicked myself for not coming across a bit more strongly about my concerns. And I just wonder about that as a white clinician. To what extent do I come forward and say, I'm not so sure this is a good idea for you? Or, you know, I'm kind of a clinician that rolls with it, but I'm also like, when I see that there's something that doesn't quite sync up for me with where they're at, that perhaps it's not right of me not to say so.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts about that?
There is that concern as a clinician, doing what's best for your client, but also maintaining client autonomy.
Of course.
And in that situation, I wonder for you, what were your concerns for this particular client engaging in race play?
The re-traumatization.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't worked through much trauma to that point. And I think they thought, and I think I kind of bought into a little bit too much, that this could be reparative, that this could be a good experience that might be reparative for them. But it flipped.
May I ask a couple things?
Sure.
So here I'm thinking of the frame I'm thinking that I'm using is edge play. So anything that really is like much higher risk physically,
yeah,
or emotionally, mentally, and it's sort of like, how long have you known your play partner? Have you talked? How much have you talked about this? And I hope it's more than one conversation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, all of those things, right? So whenever we talk with people who are very good at edge play stuff in general, you know, they were like, you know, we build a strong foundation of trust. We get to know each other really, really well before we go and do that edgy thing.
Yeah.
We really talk about like, okay, so what are we going to do if something goes wrong in the middle of it? So
and having experience navigating that previously.
Yes.
Yeah. And this was not that. This was, you know, I showed up at Tryst and this is what happened.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of, you know, really couching it in some, you know, in some trust and safety, other than the feeling of that that's what this environment was meant to present.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being dragged through the mud and whatever else happened. That was really a terrible experience.
Mm.
So I ask it not so much for myself. I mean, it is for myself, But I think that there may be, you know, a lot of us on this call who are like, what do I do in a case like that?
Mhm. Yeah. And it's definitely okay to ask your client those questions. And I think it's necessary to also maintain your client's safety of really getting a sense of what their experience has been, what their experience with their partner has been. Are they doing this with someone random or someone that they've been with for a while? Their ability to navigate those difficult situations when they come up. What's their aftercare and repair process like? And there's only so much that you could do as a counselor, but that's definitely one of them. And if they decide like, hey, I still want to do this after you've expressed concern, like maybe this isn't a play that you should lean into yet, but let's continue to talk about it. How can we get you to a space where you can engage in this type of play, and let's work on that. And that also engages with client autonomy. But if they've made that decision, the only thing at that point that you can work on is that re-traumatization and really helping them heal from that.
Yeah. And hope you're a little bit further along than you were when you first started.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
This reminds me of something. It's okay if I share something, Rami?
yeah, sure.
I was just gonna say, I remember a Dan Savage podcast, and Dan Savage not the best always, but he was talking about someone who called in and had a cuckolding fantasy, and was talking about how they were gonna set it up where like he was gonna come home to their own house and their own bed, and like this full-on scene was gonna be happening, and Dan was like, and you've never done anything like this before? And they were like, no, but I think it's gonna be great. And he was like, maybe just like show up at a bar where your partner's making out with someone and just see how that goes before you go to like the full on, and that I was thinking about that here is like, maybe that's a way we can engage with clients. And like, if they're saying like, I want to go to like the full on edge play, like really far down the road, like what can they do in that middle space to try out some of that for themselves? I don't know. I mean, client autonomy ultimately can't stop them, but I could imagine that conversation if it's like, okay, see what it's like to have someone like a white person yell at you maybe before something more significant or something, and just see how that goes,
Yes. Yeah. And also having a conversation about fantasy and reality is a good thing. And we can have fantasies about things, but in reality, it doesn't always feel the same. So for you, how can we engage in the fantasy a little bit more? And then if you want to try in the reality, like you said, introducing those small different types of things that then lead up to the big thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. You guys see Essie's question? I think some of us have that question as well.
Element to having a squicky reaction to the idea of white people engaging in race play as a dominant. Any thoughts or ways to talk about that in the therapy room? That's a great question. And I think even for people of color, the idea of having a white dominant it also inspires a squicky reaction. And it depends on the person. So like, if this was your squicky reaction as a counselor, that requires some processing of your own biases and perspectives before engaging with that in the therapy space. But if this comes up in session where you haven't had the time to really process that, I think also I talked about broaching earlier, asking your client, hey, what are your thoughts about engaging in race play and having someone who's white as your dominant? And getting their perspective and working from there. If they're cool with it, just roll with it. If they're not, then you can think of other ways to engage in race play without a white person as the dominant role.
I think I'm also wondering like how to talk to white people about that. Like if a white client were to come in and talk about like, I want to do this thing.
Another great question. This will also inspire a squeaky reaction from counselors. I think, again, it's that broaching. What do you think about engaging in race play as a white person, and have you examined what your role in that can be?
Mhm.
And if it's a very superficial kind of engagement in that, then that's definitely something to explore, that this client may not see their impact in their role as a dominant engaging in race play, but getting them to consider all of the different impacts that can have, without like trying to prevent them from engaging in race play, but rather offering research, education, other perspectives. Any other perspectives that you have on that, Richard?
Precisely that. It would be like, do they have even an inkling of essentially their privilege, or of what people of color experience in the kink community? Do they even know that? I mean, some of those numbers are like very stark. Some of those viewpoints are like very different than what most white people think is going on. So it's like, are you aware of that?
Mhm.
Kind of where I would think to start, at least part of it.
And their motivations as well.
Mhm.
Or their motivations in engaging as a white dominant in race play.
Yeah.
All right, any last questions before we finish up?
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you both for coming tonight. I'm at LifeWorks, and it just is really wonderful to have you both. It's a really important topic for us to discuss. It's a slice of life in the kink world that I think is hardly spoken of, and I really appreciate you both being here to speak to us about it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. If people could come off mute just to do a little thank you and clapping for Richard and Kez for being here.
Thank you
So
so
much.
much. Thank you.
And just a few announcements as we close. Essie just put the CEU survey in the chat. We'll also send it out. Please fill it out within a week if you're hoping to get CEs. So just so our team can make sure to get those out for you. And if you somehow didn't pay for that and would like CEs, please let us know. And just as a reminder, as Rami said, so this is KPACT, the Kink and Polyam Aware Chicago Therapists, and this is put on by LifeWorks Psychotherapy. So if you are looking to refer folks to practitioners, and maybe your practice is full, our practice is taking clients. We started this originally so that we'd have a community of therapists to be able to refer to each other. So also please get on our KPACT list if you're looking for referrals or looking to connect with the community. We also have our fellowship program that is now closed for this year, but if you know people or are someone who's interested, check us out next year for our fellows training program, where we get into topics like this in our training. Yeah, anything else before we end? Great. Well, thank you again.
Here and engaging in this super awesome conversation. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and look out for 2023 KPACT.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Dan. Thanks, Essie. Bye, Richard. Bye.
Bye, Kez.
Bye.